Hotep fam and namaste. Minister Imhotep here. The prophet Samuel once said that obedience is better than sacrifice. Obedience is better than sacrifice. And he made that statement referring to the fact that they lived in a time where there were, the animal sacrifices, the first lambs, goats, and whatever, and, the first produce. And they made the sacrifices in order to appease the gods and to satisfy their, what we would say, transgressions or sins, to make compensation for it. But the prophet said that obedience, to obey the law, is better than sacrifices to atone for any of our misdeeds. And that is true on so many levels, that instead of coming and worrying about paying your tithes and all this, and sort of a guilt fest of doing what's necessary, isn't it so much better just to know the law and obey the law, and so that you don't have to worry about those compensatory type things? That's true in man's law, and that's true in spiritual law. In man's law, they say ignorance of the law is no excuse. So even if you violate one of the principles, even if you were not aware of it, there's still going to be a consequence for it. There's a justice that is supposed to be blind, and we know that sometimes they peek through the blindfolds and apply different levels of justice, but that's for another conversation. But for this, we're going to pretend that it's Ma'at justice, where it's truly blind, and that there are consequences for our actions. Sometimes we refer to that as karma, karmic law, but there is a cause, and then there's an effect. For each action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So when we talk about sacrifice, most of us think about it in that altruistic way, where we're giving up that something of value. We're trying to help somebody, we're going to sacrifice, we're going to give up our body. We say that Jesus was a sacrifice for the atonement of sins, and so we're thinking of it in that respect. But in truth, we as true students know that the law of sacrifice is one of the keys to our overcoming, to our prosperity, to our abundance, to our achieving what it is that we desire. Because the law of sacrifice is closer to what Jesus talked about when he said about finding the pearl of great value. The person who found that, and they sold everything in order to acquire it. And that's really more so when we talk about the law of sacrifice as it relates to prosperity, as it relates to abundance, as it relates to self-mastery and fulfillment. We're talking about giving up something of lesser value to get to something of greater value. Like athletes who sacrifice their time and hours of practice, musicians, the great ones who put in the hours of practice. They didn't go outside and play with the other kids. They were restricted to staying inside and sometimes watching, observing from the picture window and seeing them out there having fun and playing ball. They thought at that time that they were sacrificing something greater for a lesser. They didn't see the value necessarily of putting in the time to become masters of their craft. But what they actually learned later on is that they were giving up the lesser for the greater, value, because it became so much more valuable for them to be able to share their creativity, to express themselves through their music, through their art, through their athletic abilities, whatever it is that they devoted that time in order to become masters of. Malcolm Gladwell talks about the 10,000 hours that's needed for mastery. A lot of times that's achieved without us even knowing it. That's going about doing the things that we are inspired to do, we like to do, we desire to do, and we're putting in that time and we're sacrificing. And many times we're not even thinking of it in those terms. And that's the ideal when we can get to that, when we recognize. See, that was the key in that Proverbs that Jesus talked about, the parable. He talked about recognizing the thing that was of a greater value. We have to be able to condition ourselves to recognize things of value, things that have worth, what it is worth sacrificing for. And many times it's not what society has placed the value on, it's what we internalize and place a value on personally. The things that are lasting, the things that have lasting, long-term value. You know, the cool kid in school who everyone liked and adored. They were admired, star athlete and everything else. And then there was the nerdy kid over in the corner studying physics and chemistry and everything else. But then as life moved on, that star athlete ended up working for the nerdy kid, because the nerdy kid developed a patent, created something that led to some sort of successful venture, and he was the one who was ultimately successful because he recognized that putting in the effort up front paid long-term dividends, where he sacrificed popularity in order to achieve true value, creating perhaps even generational wealth for his family. That's truly a pearl of great value. So we have to think about sacrifice, the law of compensation, some may even call it that. You have to give up something to get something. And are you truly cognizant of what it is that you're giving up and what it is that you're receiving on the back end? And is it worth the investment that you put in it for what you receive from it? I guess think of it in these terms. There are people who have sacrificed good health for the immediate pleasure of something that tasted good, something that felt good, but the long-term consequences ended up resulting in them having diminished physical capabilities, mental capabilities in some way. So they gave up the pearl of great value in order to achieve something immediate. It's like the story of Esau and Jacob. Esau was a man of the earth, a man of the woods, a huntsman. So you may say a man's man, whereas Jacob was more of the mama's boy. But Esau was the one that was in line to receive the inheritance, the birthright from his father, Isaac. But because of a temporary physical need, he sacrificed his pearl of great value in order to get something that was immediate and temporal and ephemeral even, that went away. He got some lentil stew, and for that he traded his birthright. We have to consider what it is that we're giving up, what it is that we're sacrificing. That hunger, I'm sure, felt intense. I'm sure he thought that he was starving, or at least it felt like he was starving in some way, and he said, I'll do anything to have that feeling taken away. But the plotting Jacob knew that he was looking at the long game, looking at the long term, and he wanted to achieve and acquire something of greater value. So you may say that he fooled his father, but we often have to metaphysically fool our Godfather as well, because it was all about feeling like the right son. And when he asked the question, are you my son, Esau? And he said, I am. He said, I am. And he had to do everything in his possibility to make his father believe that he was. And sometimes we have to do that as well in consciousness. We have to, for that universal mind, we have to proclaim that I am, whether we feel at that moment that we are or not. We have to step into it. Let the weak say, I am strong. And that proclamation becomes your statement of who you are. But back to the law of sacrifice. You have to give up something to get something. And you have to decide what it is that you're giving up. Are you giving up good health, happiness, relationships? Are you giving up true success in order to floss, to flex, to have those things that, what did they say, that moth will destroy, rust will corrupt, those things that they look shiny and flashy, but they don't last. They don't have true inherent value. And that's what we're cultivating. We know that the most valuable thing, the most valuable gem, that pearl of great value that we can find is that Christ consciousness within ourselves. And when we can recognize that, that's when we begin to give up all these other things that are of lesser value, so that we can achieve and acquire the thing that is of true value. That is knowing yourself. Minister Imhotep, and I am out. Wishing you guys peace, abundance, prosperity, happiness, all those things. And give up those lesser things in order to get those things of true value. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, or right thinking. Think a new thought about your life. And all these other things will be added unto you. Peace. Live long and prosper.